So it's still November 7th, 2020. Still looking at the issue of process-oriented guided inquiry learning applied to an examination of the Platonic dialogues, or dialogues by Plato, the Euthyphro and the Meno, and really focusing on the Euthyphro. So the pogil system is that you explore a model through what they call direct questioning. And I said in my sort of initial comments that questioning, my question about the questioning is to what degree the direct questioning should be generated by the students, and to what degree it should be, at least in part, generated by the instructor. And there's a way in which if the instructor is generating the questioning, you could reasonably say, well, this is, you're kind of leading the audience and not having the full experience of, we did it ourselves, that is important to the emotional success of a pogil system. But if you don't provide some kind of sense of what it is that the students are looking for, certainly you take much more time potentially in looking for the pattern. At the same time, if there is a pattern, and there is a pattern, but if there is a pattern, a discernible pattern, then it's discernible. And the students should be able to discern the pattern, and they should be able to say, well, Socrates says, what is the what do you say the pious is? And Euthyphro says whatever it is that he says, and Socrates says, but no, wait a second, that can't be right because of this and this. And then Euthyphro offers an alternative, and then Socrates says, well, that's fine, but that can't be right because of this and this. And then they offer yet another. What is left of the original statement? That this then can be a feedback question to the students, but that you can't raise that question of what is left, what's the common thread, how is this all in any degree connected to the basic problem or the basic question, until you've had some response. So in terms of setting up a lesson plan where you're looking at the Euthyphro from a pogil standpoint, the question that needs to be raised initially to the instructor is, do you or do you not reveal the existence of the dialectic? Do you or do you not, right from the get-go, say you are looking for a pattern in which there is a statement which is questioned and then represented in a modified form, which is in essence a new statement, which then is questioned and reformulated and that reformulation is a new statement, and so on and so on. Do you allow that to be something that the students discover completely on their own, you know, possibly with some help from their handhelds, or do you you know, do you reveal from the outset that Socrates has this thing that's called the dialectic? It's got a thesis and antithesis and a synthesis, and this is what that is. And the latter approach, where you reveal it from the beginning, is, in a certain sense, it is more efficient. And I'm not sure how much you take away the, I'm calling it the emotional value of pogil, the, you know, sense of victory when you actually find it. I don't know to what degree that is lessened by not telling students that there is such a thing as a dialectic, and that this dialogue is founded on a structure that's the dialectic, you know. It is more difficult to find the dialectic in the Euthyphro, as an example, than it is to be able to find the, you know, the metric scheme of the eagle, you know, the poem The Eagle. He clasps the crag with crooked hands, far from the sun in lonely lands. You know, you can abstract that. You know, once you say, okay, you know, look at this and find out what kind of a pattern there is to it. Well, you know, you can certainly hit upon the alliteration. You may not call it alliteration, but you know, you can hit upon that, and you can hit upon the metricity, or the metric, the meter of that. It is more difficult to find the dialectic. The dialectic is more, you might say, abstract. It's more complex. It's more concealed than a lot of poetic schemes, and it is of the nature of poetry that Le Guin said it's a patterned intensity of language. Now, the dialectic is a patterned intensity of language, so in a certain sense it is poetic, but it's a much more dissipated rhythm than, or a much more abstract rhythm than you tend to encounter in poetry. So again, you know, letting students go on Alfred Lord Tennyson, you know, is probably going to have a quicker and better success, also because they've probably already encountered certain ideas about meter and so on, than it is letting them go on the dialectic. But you know, this is a fundamental question. How much of a model do you present? So the next step in pogil is concept invention. And it's an interesting phrase. I mean, concept invention. It's an interesting phrase. And what's interesting about it to me, or what intrigues me about it, what interests me about it, is that there is the term, when you say these words, concept invention, we're accustomed to thinking of invention as being a novelty. So like a complete novelty. When you invent something, nothing like this has ever been before. This is completely new. Whereas here, I think what what is more sensible to think about this term as being is that what's being invented is the concept in the individual learner's mind. So this is a new invention to them, but not necessarily to the world. In other words, looking at the Euthyphro, the learners who have never heard the term dialectic before, they've never read the Euthyphro before, and maybe this is the first thing that they've ever read by Plato. You know, they're coming to this absolutely fresh, and they're encountering it, and they're constructing for themselves concepts, templates to deal with, you know, if nothing else, to deal with the assignment. And so the invention is an internal invention of the individual. It's possible that an utterly new invention could arise out of this process, and you know, in a sense, we sort of hope for that. It would be wonderful to be present in a moment when you know, an utterly new insight as to Plato and what's going on in Platonic dialogue should arise. The likelihood of it does not seem very great, but you know, we shouldn't suppose that it can't happen. But when we say invention, you know, we're giving, it's kind of a weak version of invention, you know, in terms of the general thought of this term, you know, is proposing something like a moment of genius innovation, whereas what we're really looking at here is, you know, concept invention. In this sense, we could say, well, you know, the first time a child grasps that the term red is being applied to things like this, you know, what we all agree are red things, you know, that's concept invention. And then, you know, you say, oh, good, you know, Lucretia, you know, you've recognized that is red, and that is red, and that is red. Oh, no, that's not red, that's green, you know. But the concept, so to speak, has been invented, but in that mind. And it is presumably a moment which occurs. So, you know, when the child grasps, oh, this is a map, and this is what is the significance of a map, and I can use a map this way and this way and this way, you know, that's a moment of concept invention. But it's not that there's never ever been a map before, and Lucretia has just discovered a map with red bits on it, you know, or what have you. It's a tremendous moment for an individual, but not something record-breaking, you know, for the whole. And that's, you know, this is one of the things that is a little difficult about education, because these moments, which are really great triumphs for an individual, often really are just kind of passed off as being, okay, well, you know, now we move you on to grade 2, you know, whereas what children have accomplished, you know, in acquiring the conceptual invention of alphabet, you know, or phonemes, and that I can write things down, and I can even write things down that I've never even seen this word, but I've heard it, and I can find a way to represent it. And these are enormous conceptual triumphs that, you know, that the average person accomplishes, and so in a sense they're not treated as the triumphs that they are. And I think that that's part of the advantage of pogil, is that you know, in a sense it gives opportunities for these discoveries, and to some degree, at any rate, it should be celebrating them or rewarding them a bit more than they tend to be. You know, it's possible to have this concept invention just by, you know, somebody's telling you this and this and this and this, and you know, it kind of comes together. I think the notion of pogil as an overarching framework is that you want those things to come about through an active process, rather than a passive process where, you know, these words are being presented and, oh, now I put that together with something, but I don't really have an ownership of it. Want to have a greater ownership of it, and that's what pogil offers. In the Euthyphro, this issue of invention, but it's not necessarily a novelty. It's a novelty to the individual, but not, you know, in a corporate sense. What you really want the students to be getting out of the Euthyphro, I think, is not really piety. I mean, not any kind of conclusions that they make about piety. There are a few things in there that, you know, that the question of whether something is pious because the gods love it, or whether the gods love it because it's pious, you know, how values are determined, whether there's extrinsic or intrinsic qualities of a moral, intrinsic or extrinsic moral properties of some act, that you know, that's valuable, and there are a number of other little, you know, pieces of this that have some value, and maybe very considerable value. But I think that the main point of the exercise of looking at the Euthyphro is that it's such a great illustration of the dialectic, and the dialectic is really an excellent model for any kind of definitional examination of a problem. Not the Euthyphro itself, you know, but the dialectic that's there, and very nicely illustrated by the Euthyphro. So how do you get students to abstract on their own, to abstract the dialectic, and to have this sense of victory, you know, sense of success, that they have found this, and then to move on from and then we give it a name. At that point, you know, you found this. What is this that you found? It's the dialectic. And what is the dialectic? Well, it's got this and this and this, and then this becomes this, and this and this, and this becomes this, and this and this. Okay, that's the dialectic, and these three parts are the antithesis, or the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis becomes a new thesis. And then you have a new antithesis and a new synthesis, and that synthesis becomes a new thesis, and so on and so on. Oh yes, we knew that. We just didn't have words for it. So now we've got these words. So this is one of the things that they say on the pogil website, you know, that terms are introduced. Well, you know, I'm giving you these specialty terms that describe the experience that putatively, hypothetically, you know, the learners are getting. And here's one of the concerns that I have about on on the one hand, it may be basically a concern about my own capacity as an instructor, more than it is an issue with the method. But I don't really find, as I have approached this in the past, and I've tried various ways of getting at this, when we get to the third stage, which is application, I don't know whether it's that we need more experience of it, or whether we need to be using it more. I do encourage students to use the dialectic as a means by which to construct analytical essays. So I actively encourage students to use the format, and I usually do see it, but always in a very truncated form. So here's the thesis, here's the antithesis, here's the synthesis, and that's my whole paper. And I've created that to some degree myself by emphasizing the way in which one can generate an analytical essay using those three elements as though they are three segments of a paper, because, you know, it's how I've presented it. Whereas Plato is rather than having a long articulated statement, these tend to be rather brief statements, which are often a little bit less briefly analyzed and then restated again, usually fairly briefly by Socrates' interlocutor. So when we get to the point of application, what clearly needs to be present is a good understanding of the fundamental structure of how the dialectic works. And if one is able to find it oneself in the Euthyphro, then, you know, one has a better sense than if Mr. Ochterman says, okay, here's a chart that shows you where the dialectic is in the Euthyphro. And when I have asked students to try to do that breakdown, they often do it rather differently than I would. So they tend to, first of all, what they tend to do is to look at the Euthyphro as a whole, and they say, okay, well, here's the beginning and here's the end. So the beginning must be the thesis and the end must be the synthesis, and so what's in the middle must be the antithesis. And so there you are, Mr. Ochterman. Well, you know, where do you begin this section and where do you begin this section? And that becomes a little more vague. So again, there's often a lot of difficulty when I present the concept of the dialectic in taking that to the point of breaking down the individual statements of the dialogue and seeing, you know, where a cycle of the dialectic begins and where it ends. That just does not seem to be something that there's a lot of student success with that. Now, again, there's an issue of, I've got 15 weeks. The Euthyphro is something that I intend to look at for maybe 2 class sessions out of those 15 weeks. You know, so I'm only going to be, there's not enough time in the way that a non-pogil great works examination of Introduction to Philosophy, where you want to not just get method, but also look at something as sort of a history of ideas and also some degree of comparative cultures. So, you know, typically, as I've taught Introduction to Philosophy, we start with Plato, and then we look at Epictetus, and then we look at Lao Tzu, and then we look at the Bhagavad Gita, and then we come back to the Western world with Descartes, and then sometimes Anselm, sometimes I'm trying to think, I guess Kant. Usually it goes Descartes and then Kant in terms of the way that I've taught it. And then there's something else, you know, at the end. But sometimes it's just Socrates, Socrates, Epictetus, Lao Tzu, the Gita, or the Upanishads. Sometimes I've done just the Upanishads generally, and then Descartes, and then Kant, and you know, something along those lines. But you know, it's a lot to cover, and to spend the investigative time trying to tease the dialectic out, you know, requires more time than you have in 15 weeks, you know, to get through all that material. So this is, you know, it's a puzzlement, you know, it's a problem that you got to really think through before you set up your class. You can't have, you know, a class calendar established where you're going to be looking at, you know, these 6 or 7 or 8 works, and then want to do a pogil analysis of dialectic. And when the students kind of bog down in that, you know, how do you get that going? And then there's a further question, which is, okay, so you can do the pogil thing in this way to abstract the dialectic, but what equivalent are you going to do, or is there anything that you could do equivalent for Epictetus, for Lao Tzu, for the Gita? You know, how are you going to sort of keep up this style, or are you just doing it for the one? Are you going to take the dialectic and build anything on that? Are you going to use that to as a template by which to analyze the other works, for example? And there's a potential that you could do that. It's not something that I have done, but it could be done that way. So anyway, it's not a great conclusion, but I'm going to pause there anyway.